Amara Vale had everything a person could dream of: a mansion with walls of glass, cars that gleamed like mirrors, and a reputation that made her name echo in every business circle. Yet, as she stood inside her grand garden room one quiet morning, surrounded by dying plants and fading petals, she felt a strange emptiness she could not explain. The air smelled faintly of soil and decay, a scent she had learned to ignore. Rows of glass pots lined the walls, each one filled with expensive soil imported from different worlds and tended by experts she had hired at great cost. Still, not one flower had survived. The bright lights and perfect temperature did nothing. Every plant turned brown and fragile within days. Her assistants whispered theories. Maybe the air was too dry, maybe the fertilizer too strong, but Amara no longer cared for excuses. She simply stared at the lifeless leaves, her reflection shining faintly in the glass panels around her, and wondered why nothing seemed to grow in her world anymore. People saw her as a woman who had conquered success, yet she often wondered what that meant when her life had no warmth. Her home was filled with gold and silence. Every morning began with orders, meetings, and numbers, and every evening ended with the same quiet loneliness that followed her, like a shadow. The garden had been her attempt to create beauty, a living, breathing space in the middle of her controlled world, but instead, it had become another reminder that something was missing. One night, as she walked through the quiet halls, she paused by the glass door that led into the garden. Moonlight spilled across the marble floor, touching the dead petals that lay scattered like fallen memories. For a moment, she felt an ache in her chest, the kind she used to feel before she learned to bury her emotions under work and wealth. She knelt beside a pot, touching the dry soil with her fingertips, and it crumbled into dust. She could almost hear the echo of her own life in that brittle sound. Maybe the garden was not the problem. Maybe she was. The thought unsettled her, yet she couldn't ignore it. How could someone who controlled empires not nurture a single flower? That question followed her to bed, stayed with her through meetings, and haunted her reflection in the mirror. Her assistant suggested replacing the garden with something artificial, a digital display of flowers that never died. But Amara refused. She didn't want something fake. She wanted life, real and growing. As the days passed, she began to feel drawn to the garden again, as though it was trying to tell her something she had forgotten long ago. And while she didn't know it yet, that dying space of soil and silence was about to bring someone into her world. Someone who would teach her that true growth could never be bought, only nurtured. The morning was unusually quiet when Amara's head of staff entered her study, his expression hesitant, as if unsure how she would react. He cleared his throat and said a man was waiting outside, a gardener, unlike the specialists she had hired before. Amara raised an eyebrow, tired of false promises and wasted effort, but curiosity made her nod. When the man stepped inside, he looked completely out of place in her world of perfection. His clothes were plain, his boots still dusty from work, and his hands were rough and marked by years of labor. Yet there was something steady in his eyes, a calmness that felt almost unsettling. He introduced himself simply as Samuel, not bowing, not flattering her, just speaking in a low, even tone that carried quiet confidence. Amara studied him for a moment, waiting for him to offer a list of techniques or expensive materials like the others had. But he didn't. Instead, he walked toward the glass wall, looking at the wilted plants with a kind of gentleness she hadn't seen before. "Plants don't grow for those who demand them to," he said after a pause. "They grow for those who listen." His words made Amara blink in confusion. "Listen," she repeated, almost amused. "They're plants, not people." Samuel smiled faintly, but said nothing. That silence, calm and deliberate, unsettled her more than any argument could have. Most people rushed to impress her, but he seemed in no hurry to explain himself or prove his worth. There was something strange about that, strange and strangely honest. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the only sound being the hum of the temperature regulators, keeping the room perfectly balanced, and yet lifeless. Finally, Amara crossed her arms and said, "Very well, you may try, but don't expect miracles." Samuel nodded once. "I never expect miracles," he said softly. "I just expect patience." With that, he stepped out toward the garden, moving slowly among the dead leaves as though he were greeting old friends. Amara watched him through the glass, still unsure why she had agreed to this. There was nothing special about him, no degrees, no machines, no promises. And yet, the stillness that surrounded him made her uneasy, as if something in her carefully built world had just been quietly disturbed. Later that day, when her staff asked if they should bring him better tools or supplies, Amara surprised herself by saying no. "Let him do it his way," she said without knowing why. That night, as she passed by the garden once more, she saw him still there, under the soft glow of the garden lights, sitting cross-legged beside the dying plants, not working, just watching, listening. For the first time, she felt something stir in the air, faint but undeniable, as if life itself had started to breathe again, not loudly, but quietly, waiting for her to notice. Samuel arrived early every morning, long before the household stirred, and went straight to the garden. Amara often watched him from her study window, coffee in hand, still half asleep, and wondering what exactly he was doing. He didn't rush or give commands like the other gardeners had. Instead, he would kneel beside the dry soil, press his fingers into it, and close his eyes, as though listening to something she couldn't hear. Sometimes he would lift a handful of earth, smell it gently, and let it fall back between his fingers. It was strange, unsettling even, to see a grown man sitting silently among dead plants, doing nothing for hours. "He's just sitting there," Amara muttered one morning, irritation creeping into her voice. She was used to seeing action, results, and measurable progress, not a man meditating in the dirt. Her staff whispered about him too, unsure whether he was wise or simply wasting time. But Samuel never seemed to notice their stares. He moved with patience, tending to each pot as though every one of them mattered. One afternoon, Amara walked into the garden herself, pretending to inspect something just to watch him closer. The air was cool and still, filled only with the soft sound of his humming. It wasn't a song she recognized, just a low, soothing tune that seemed to blend with the faint rustle of dry leaves. She watched as he filled a small metal can with water and poured it slowly, carefully, over the roots of a half-dead rose plant. There was no hurry in his movements, no frustration, just quiet care. For the first time, she noticed the garden felt different. The usual tension, the feeling of emptiness, had softened somehow. Even the air felt calmer. Samuel glanced up once, caught her watching, and gave a small, knowing smile before returning to his work. That simple moment unsettled Amara more than she wanted to admit. It felt as though he understood something she didn't. Later, as the day turned to evening, she walked through the garden alone. It wasn't any greener, the plants still drooped, but there was a strange sense of peace she couldn't explain, a kind of stillness that wrapped around her like a quiet breath. For someone who had spent her life surrounded by noise, people, and control, it felt foreign but comforting. She realized that in all her years, she had never once sat quietly with anything that wasn't perfect or successful. Samuel's silence made her uneasy, yet also strangely drawn to it. Maybe, she thought, he wasn't waiting for the plants to change. Maybe he was waiting for something else, something she hadn't yet learned to hear. That night, as she looked at her reflection in the glass walls of the garden, Amara caught herself wondering, for the first time, if silence could grow life, where effort had always failed. The morning sun filtered softly through the glass walls of the garden, painting golden lines across the rows of wilted plants. Amara stood beside Samuel, watching as he knelt once again in the dirt, his sleeves rolled up, his hands steady and gentle. "Why don't you use the new irrigation system?" she finally asked, trying to sound curious rather than critical. Samuel looked up at her with a small, patient smile and said, "Plants don't need perfection. They need presence." His words hung in the air, confusing yet oddly peaceful. Amara had spent her whole life chasing perfection in business, in her home, in herself, and now this quiet gardener was telling her that what mattered most was simply being there. Samuel motioned for her to kneel beside him. She hesitated, then sighed and lowered herself to the ground, feeling the cool soil beneath her knees. He handed her a small trowel and showed her how to loosen the earth around the roots of a dying fern. "Touch it," he said softly. She frowned, reluctant at first, but then pressed her fingers into the soil. It was damp and uneven, sticking to her skin. "See," he murmured, "it's not about fixing. It's about feeling." She didn't understand it fully, but the way he said it made her pause. For years, she had delegated everything from her meals to her meetings, never taking time to feel anything real. Now, here she was, with dirt on her expensive clothes and hands covered in mud, and for some strange reason, she didn't mind. Samuel showed her how to check the soil's texture before watering, explaining that too much care can be just as harmful as too little. "You don't feed life by flooding it," he said, his tone calm, as if he were talking about more than plants. She laughed awkwardly as she tried to mimic his movements, nearly spilling the water all over her shoes. "You're rushing," Samuel said gently. "Slow down." She did, and when she accidentally splashed some water on herself, she laughed, really laughed for the first time in years. The sound surprised even her. Samuel looked at her with quiet approval, his eyes warm but unreadable. As the day went on, she stayed in the garden long after he finished working, repeating the small tasks he had shown her. There was no music, no noise, just the soft whisper of water hitting soil and the gentle hum of life returning. For the first time, Amara didn't feel like she was fighting her garden. She felt like she was listening to it. The air seemed lighter, and even the dying plants looked somehow softer under the afternoon sun. That evening, as she walked back to her mansion with muddy hands and a quiet smile, she realized something had shifted inside her, something small, fragile, and alive, just like the first roots of a seed beginning to grow in forgotten soil. The morning light slipped through the glass ceiling of Amara's garden, warm and golden, touching every pot and petal with quiet grace. She had grown used to disappointment. Every day, she would check the soil, water carefully, and find nothing but stillness. But this morning was different. As she bent down beside the same pot she had tended for weeks, her eyes caught something she had never seen before, a tiny green sprout pushing through the dark soil. For a long moment, she just stared, not trusting what she saw. It was so small, so fragile, yet it stood tall against the damp earth like a whisper of hope. A smile spread across her face, not the kind she used at parties or for photos, but a real, unguarded one. She rushed across the garden, her footsteps echoing against the glass floor, and called out for Samuel. When he appeared, wiping his hands on a rag, she pointed at the pot, almost breathless. "Look, it's alive," she said, her voice full of surprise and joy. Samuel walked over slowly, crouched beside the pot, and examined the little leaf. Then he looked up at her, his calm eyes softening. "You see," he said quietly, "life listens when you stop trying to control it." His words settled deep inside her, more powerful than any speech she had ever heard in her world of business and success. She knelt beside him, staring at the green sprout again. It wasn't much, just a leaf, a few inches of stem, but to her, it felt like a miracle. Every day after that, she visited the garden before breakfast. She would check the leaf, water it carefully, and talk to it, as Samuel once suggested. Sometimes, she would tell it about her day, her plans, her regrets, things she hadn't told anyone in years. She realized that nurturing life wasn't about control or perfection. It was about patience, care, and trust, things she had forgotten how to give. Samuel never praised her directly, but she could see the quiet pride in his eyes when he watched her working. "You're learning," he said one morning, as she brushed soil from her hands. "Not just about plants." His words made her pause. She began to see how her life, too, had been like that barren garden, too managed, too guarded, too artificial. Now, every new bud, every small leaf, became a symbol of something changing inside her. Weeks passed, and the garden began to show signs of life. A little color here, a new scent there. It wasn't sudden, but it was real. And every time Amara saw that first green leaf, she remembered the lesson it had brought her, that some of the most beautiful things grow only when you stop forcing them and start listening instead. Amara's days slowly began to change in ways no one around her could understand. The woman who once lived by schedules, meetings, and endless deadlines now spent her mornings kneeling in the soil with her hands covered in dirt. The glass garden that had once felt like a trophy now felt alive, warm, breathing, and full of quiet lessons. She stopped taking business calls while tending to her plants, letting her phone ring until it went silent. Her assistants grew restless, whispering that their employer was losing focus, that the Iron Lady of industry had somehow softened. But Amara didn't care. For the first time in her life, she didn't measure her worth by her calendar or bank account. She measured it by the life growing beneath her fingertips. The garden had become her teacher. Samuel often found her sitting cross-legged beside the flower beds, whispering to the leaves or brushing the dirt from her palms like someone handling fragile glass. When he asked how her day was, she no longer spoke of profits or clients. She spoke of how the soil felt cooler that morning, or how a bud had turned toward the light. The woman who once demanded results had learned to wait, to observe, and to trust nature's pace. The stillness that used to make her uncomfortable now felt like peace. Sometimes, in the middle of the day, she would pause to listen, not to people, but to the quiet rustle of leaves, or the slow hum of bees hovering near a bloom. There was a time when she thought silence meant emptiness. Now she realized it was full of life, full of meaning, full of the things she had ignored while chasing everything else. Her neighbors began to talk. They said the famous Amara Vale had gone quiet, that perhaps she was lonely or tired of her empire, but they didn't see what was truly happening. She was not losing herself. She was finding herself again, buried beneath years of noise. One evening, as she pressed her hand into the soil, she noticed how firm and cool it felt, how her fingers left small marks that slowly disappeared as the earth settled again. In that moment, she understood what Samuel had meant about presence, that true strength didn't come from control, but from connection. Her life, once restless and scattered, now felt grounded, like the roots beneath her hands. She didn't need applause, approval, or headlines. What she needed was here, in the still air of her garden, in the rhythm of her breath, and the growing things that no longer feared her touch. For the first time in years, Amara wasn't running toward anything or away from anything. She was simply here, living, learning, and letting her heart take root beside the flowers she had finally learned to keep alive. The days turned into weeks, and soon the once lifeless garden that had embarrassed Amara became a place of color and fragrance. Lilies opened like small cups of light, daisies turned their faces toward the morning sun, and roses unfolded in soft waves of red and white. Every morning, when she stepped into the garden barefoot, the air felt different, alive, almost humming with quiet joy. Amara would kneel near the flower beds, her fingertips brushing over petals as delicate as silk, and smile without even realizing it. She had once thought the plants were the ones growing, but slowly she understood that something deeper was happening. She was growing too. The woman who used to chase meetings and deadlines now waited eagerly to see which flower would bloom next. Her days no longer felt heavy. They felt full. One morning, she cut a few roses, wrapped them in plain paper, and handed them to her driver. "Take these to the hospital," she said softly. That simple act became the first of many. Every week, she began sharing flowers to schools, to nurses, to lonely neighbors who hadn't received a visitor in years. People started to talk again, but this time, their whispers were different. They said, the millionaire who once lived behind gates was now knocking on doors with flowers in her hands. Some didn't even recognize her. Dressed in a simple shirt with dirt-stained fingers and a smile that seemed to carry sunlight. Each bouquet she gave carried a piece of her transformation, proof that beauty wasn't meant to be kept behind glass, but shared. Samuel often watched her quietly, saying little, though his eyes always held pride. He had taught her to listen to the soil, but she had taught herself something greater, how to listen to her heart. Every time she planted a new seed, she whispered a small wish, not for wealth, not for success, but for life to grow where there had once been emptiness. Her home, once filled with luxury, but void of laughter, now echoed with the sound of her humming as she worked. Visitors who came to see her for business found themselves drawn instead to her garden, where the air seemed to carry a strange peace. Amara didn't boast about her new skill. She didn't even think of it as one. She simply lived it. The more she nurtured her plants, the more she understood herself, that she didn't need to control everything to make it thrive. Her hands, which had once signed contracts and counted profits, were now stained with soil, not a mark of labor, but of life. And every bloom that opened reminded her that the greatest growth didn't happen in the garden outside, it happened in the quiet, unseen places within her own soul. The afternoon sun hung low, painting the garden in shades of gold, when Samuel arrived at Amara's home. The flowers swayed softly in the breeze, their petals brushing against each other like whispers of gratitude. Amara looked up from where she was trimming a rose bush and smiled when she saw him standing at the gate, his hat in his hands and that same calm expression she had grown used to. But there was something different in his eyes, a quiet farewell that she didn't yet understand. "You've come early today," she said, brushing the dirt from her palms. Samuel smiled faintly and looked around the garden that was now overflowing with life. "I came to say goodbye," he said gently. The words hit her like a sudden chill. "Goodbye, but why? The garden still needs you." He shook his head, his voice steady and kind. "No, Amara, you don't need me anymore." She tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. He continued, "You've learned what I came to teach, to listen, not just to soil and plants, but to life itself." Amara's chest tightened. She looked around at the flowers, at the vines curling gracefully around the pillars, at the sunlight dancing across the leaves. Every bit of it had Samuel's touch. "But who will guide me?" she whispered. Samuel knelt near the gate, scooping a small handful of soil. "You already have a guide," he said, placing the soil back into the earth and pressing a tiny seed into it. "This one will remind you that growth never ends. Just because something has bloomed doesn't mean it's done teaching you." He patted the earth gently, the way he always did, as if greeting an old friend. Amara stood silently, her heart caught between gratitude and sorrow. She wanted to thank him for more than just the garden, for helping her rediscover a part of herself. She didn't know she had lost, but she couldn't find the right words. Samuel looked up at her, his smile warm and unshaken. "When the wind moves through the leaves," he said softly, "that's life speaking. When something wilts, that's life teaching. You just have to keep listening." Then, with one last nod, he rose and began to walk away down the sunlit path. Amara watched until he disappeared beyond the gate, the scent of blooming roses following him like a farewell. For a long while, she stood in silence, the garden suddenly feeling both full and empty at once. Then she turned toward the small patch where he had planted the final seed. She knelt, touching the soil with trembling fingers, and whispered, "I'll take care of this one." The breeze stirred around her, carrying a faint rustle through the leaves, almost like a reply. And though Samuel was gone, his presence remained in every breath of wind, every petal that opened, and every quiet heartbeat of the garden he had helped her grow. The months slipped quietly into new seasons, and the garden continued to live and breathe on its own. Samuel never returned, just as he had promised, but his presence lingered in every leaf that moved and every petal that opened beneath the morning sun. Amara often found herself walking to the small patch near the gate where he had planted the final seed. At first, there was only bare soil, and she would kneel beside it each day, gently pressing her fingers into the dirt, wondering if it would ever grow. Then one morning, after a night of soft rain, she saw a tiny green sprout pushing through the earth, fragile but determined. It was the first thing she saw before even stepping inside her house that day, and something inside her stirred, a quiet joy mixed with gratitude. She began to care for it, as if it were something sacred. Days turned into weeks, and that small sprout grew taller and stronger, reaching toward the sky as if chasing the light itself. By the time summer came, it had become a beautiful sunflower, golden, tall, and proud, standing guard by the gate, as though watching over the garden. Amara would sit beside it every morning, her tea in hand, and talk softly as if Samuel were sitting beside her again. Sometimes, the sunflower swayed gently in the breeze, and she liked to imagine it was nodding in reply. It became her silent companion, a living reminder of everything she had learned. Each time she looked at it, she remembered Samuel's voice, "Growth never ends." The garden around her now flourished without effort, the soil rich, the air sweet with the scent of life. She understood now that none of it came from the expensive tools, the imported soil, or the systems she once believed in. True growth, she realized, came from patience, from gentle attention, and from the willingness to listen instead of control. The sunflower reminded her that even something as small as a seed could become something magnificent if given time and care, just like people. Sometimes visitors would stop at her gate and marvel at the single bright flower, standing tall among the rest. They would ask what kind of fertilizer she used, or how she managed to grow it so perfectly, and she would only smile and say, it just needed someone to believe in it. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. It was a symbol of her journey, of her change, of a friendship that had rooted deeper than any plant ever could. In that sunflower's golden face, she saw herself, no longer wilting under pressure or trying to control every outcome, but standing tall, grounded, and quietly radiant, nourished by all the lessons life had finally taught her. Years passed, and Amara's once private sanctuary transformed into something far greater than she had ever imagined. The grand gates that once kept the world out now stood open every morning, welcoming anyone who wished to enter. The garden had grown into a living masterpiece, winding paths lined with roses, sunflowers that reached for the sky, and small corners filled with the gentle hum of bees and the soft sound of water flowing over stones. But more than its beauty, it carried a feeling, a kind of peace that wrapped around anyone who stepped inside. Amara named it the Listening Garden. People came from nearby towns and faraway cities to see it, but soon they realized they weren't there just for the flowers. They came to breathe, to rest, and to feel something they couldn't quite name, something healing. Children would run through the pathways laughing. Elders sat on benches under blooming trees, sharing old stories, and strangers found quiet moments sitting beside the sunflower by the gate. Now tall and strong, still watching over the place where it all began. Amara often walked among them, her steps slow, her hands brushing against leaves like greeting old friends. She no longer looked like the sharp, untouchable businesswoman she once was. Her clothes were simple, her hair tied loosely, her smile calm and full of warmth. Whenever someone asked how such a magnificent place came to be, she would tell them the story of how there was a time when nothing here would grow. No matter how much money she spent, or how many experts she hired. She spoke of a quiet gardener who had taught her that plants, like people, needed presence more than perfection. Life, she would say softly, blooms not through power, but through care. Visitors always listened with stillness in their eyes, as if the story itself was watering something inside them. Some would leave with a single flower she offered, others with tears, and many with a smile, as if they had remembered something important about their own lives. The garden had become a place where growth wasn't measured in petals or size, but in the quiet ways people's hearts changed after being there. And for Amara, it was no longer just about the plants. It was about connection between soil and sky, between people and peace, between what is seen and what is felt. As the sun set each evening, she would sit near the gate, beneath the tall sunflower, and watch as the last light touched its golden petals. Sometimes, she thought of Samuel and whispered a thank you into the breeze. The millionaire who once couldn't grow a single flower had finally learned how to grow a life full of them, not through wealth, but through patience, kindness, and the simple act of listening.